Let's now get into a class of risk which are really severe, which are called business continuity risk, which means this risk, if they materialize, if they happen, can actually disrupt the continuity of the business. The business may actually stop because they're very severe. And companies have to make alternate plans, which are called contingency plan, business continuity plans, BCPs, to make sure that if those risks happen, there is a plan B to make sure the company doesn't shut down completely. So what are some of these risks? Natural calamities, COVID, floods, the whole factory is flooded out, fire, hurricanes, cyclones, etc. Power outages. If power fails, because most businesses will use power, whether you are using servers or you are using machines, they need power to operate. And if there's a power outage for several hours or 1 or 2 days or several days because of a major mishap, business shuts down. Cyber attack, the servers, the softwares, they're disrupted. Planes cannot take off. Trains cannot run. Ships will struggle to sail. GPS may get corrupted because the signal to GPS and the GPS, the global positioning systems, disrupts a lot of activities. Pandemic, I've already talked about, and supply chain, wars. So a country like Ukraine may be a big supplier of sunflower seeds. But if there's a war between Russia and Ukraine, then India, which uses a lot of sunflower oil but doesn't get access to Ukrainian sunflower, then we'll have problems. Similarly, India exports rice. And if there's a problem in shipping because of wars, then a lot of countries will not get access to Indian rice. And that becomes a big risk. So these risks are severe enough to shut down the operations of a company, and therefore they must have a plan B. Now let's move into how do you manage risk. If there's so many risks, how do you manage it? So there are tools and techniques of identifying risk, classifying risk, and then planning to mitigate those risks. And it starts with something called a risk matrix. A risk matrix basically classifies risk on 2 axes. So let's look at the 2 axes. So on the top x-axis, you will see written probability. What is the probability of that risk? From very low, low, medium, high to very high. And then on the left vertical axis, you will see the impact of that risk. Very low to low, medium, high, very high. Obviously, the impact of the risk is very low and the probability of the risk is very low. You can live with it. So there may be risk where the impact is very high, but the probability is very low. For example, a plane crash. The probability of a plane crash today is very low, but the impact is very, very high because lives can be lost. And then you can have risk whose probability is very high, but the impact is very low. If you're playing football or something, chances are you'll get hurt. But the impact of it may be very low. It may be just pain, aches, etc. But the real risky ones that you have to look out for are the high impact, high probability ones, which will probably happen, and if it happens, the impact is very high. So the first step of risk management is to identify the risk, analyze the risk, categorize the risk. And depending on the impact into probability, you have different plans. For example, high impact, high probability in today's world may be a cyber attack. A cyber attack which brings down your entire server base. So that has to have a plan B, that has to have a contingency system. And therefore, most companies will have a primary server in, let's say, Bombay, and a secondary server in Chennai. So if the Bombay comes attack, or is burnt, or power goes out, or is flooded, company doesn't shut down, the Bombay one is down, but the Chennai server takes up the load. So that's how you have a contingency plan. And when you have plans for all of these different kinds of risk plans, okay, you come up with what is called the risk mitigation strategy. And many ways of mitigating the risk, which means reducing the impact of the risk, will make sure that the company can operate smoothly even if bad things happen, even if some of the risk becomes reality. The company is not really impacted. And this set of plans is called the risk mitigation strategy. And what is the risk mitigation process? As I said, identification, assessment, controlling, and monitoring. That's about the company. And we'll look at an example in a while. But then who becomes aware of the risk? The company is taking some steps. But who should know about the risk? So this takes you into the area of risk disclosure. For example, many of you may have bought shares in a company. You are in the stock market. And you have bought shares of a Tata company, a Godrej company, a Mahindra company, Adani or Ambani, or you have bought an overseas share, Apple or Google or a Chinese company. So you become a shareholder. Or you're a bank, you have lent money to the company. Or you're the government, and you're making sure that no company is doing bad things like money laundering or polluting the environment. And sometimes the businesses are what are called essential services. Hospitals, planes, trains. Those are essential services. So those risks to each of those businesses must be disclosed to the outside world, to the shareholders, to the banks, the lenders, to the government, if you're an essential service, and so on. And therefore, there are disclosure norms, which basically means that you must report it in your annual report if you are a listed entity. And I'll show you an example in a while. But you must disclose it in a way that is not garbled, but is very clear, simple terms for a layman to understand. Because many of the shareholders of a company may be not very sophisticated financial analysts or an MBA. They must be able to understand the risks of the company because they're buying shares in the company. It's also any company, a large company may have 1,000 risks, but not everything is material, not everything is important. So it's no point reporting 1,000 risks. What you need to probably report are the top 10, or the top 20, or the most material ones. You must also give updates to the outside world. You should also give the quantum of risk For example, is it 1 crore rupees, $1 million, $5 million? What is the quantum of the risk if the worst case scenario comes through? If you manage it, the worst case will not come through. Maybe no loss will happen, or half the loss will happen, but you should still disclose what is the worst case scenario. Also, the risk cannot be managed at the frontline lowest junior most level. It has to be managed with visibility up to the leadership team and through to the management board. And they should be aware of what are the risks and how the risks are being managed. And that comes under the norms of risk disclosure. So let's look at an example. Here's an example of Tata Motors from the annual report, and the link is below. I would encourage all of you to actually have a look at the Tata Motors annual report, where I have shown some extracts, but you can look up annual reports of many companies. Most of them will have a risk management section. The link to the Tata Motors annual report is provided. So if you look at the content, if you can't read it on the screen, you can look it up yourself. You will find there's a section on risk management. All well-governed companies disclose their risk in a very transparent way, and are required to do so if you are listed. If you go to those pages where the risk management or the risks are being reported, you will find the Tata Motors in this case has actually qualified different kinds of risk, like I talked about earlier. Please look it up. You can download the report and look up those pages, and you'll see how nicely they have categorized the risk. And here's the risk matrix. They've also said what are the top 10 risks, and you'll see that they've talked about what are the impact and what are the probabilities, and they've qualified it in a grading, and they've numbered it. And for each risk in their annual report, which goes to all the shareholders, which goes to the government, which goes to the banks, the lenders, and is open to the whole world. You and I can look at it. We are looking at it now. They have very clearly said, these are my risks, and here's how we are managing this risk. Here are plans. And that is why companies such as Tata Motors or the Tata Group or Godrej or Mahindra's, or if you look outside India, the best companies are so transparent in their risk management processes and how they manage their risk so well, and how do they ensure that there's minimum possible disruptions to their day-to-day operations because of the risk. Risks may still become unmanageable, for example, during the COVID times. It was such a big risk. Nobody anticipated it. There was no risk identification. There was no risk mitigation, and it created havoc in the world. But COVID is a once-in-a-lifetime, hopefully, risk that materialized. Nobody knew of it. Billions of people died. Thousands of companies shut down. But these are very, very rare. Hopefully, it will never happen in the next few decades or centuries. But identifiable risk needs to be identified, analyzed, mitigated, reported, managed to minimize disruptions to the business. So again, please take 3 minutes to reflect and write down in your journal the risks that you had thought of in the earlier reflection point of that company which you had thought of. How do you think they would be managing their risk? If it's a listed company, I would strongly encourage you to download their annual report, have a look at the risk management section, and look at their disclosure related to risk. So please reflect. So that brings me to the end of this module. Thank you. Namaskar.